Hey everyone, welcome back to day two or module two. Pleased to have you with us today, taking the next step in the 5 days of focus. So let's get into it. How did I get here? Now, again, we're continuing on with our smartphone. And again, we're continuing to consider all of these amazing apps and capabilities and incredible things in there. Just like we're acknowledging whether we feel like it or not, we ourselves are amazing and capable of so many things. But again, all of this is contingent on having enough energy, on having enough power to be able to access all this amazingness. So if we draw ourselves in firstly again to our smartphone, what becomes interesting here is that when the battery gets low, the smartphone starts running out of battery. It automatically can self-protect or deactivate, or shut down. It doesn't need to worry about who's using the phone or perhaps what functions it's performing. It goes into auto mode as soon as it's losing too much power. And you can see there the illustration that automatically just takes action to look after itself. Us humans, well, again, we know we need enough battery power, we need enough energy to be able to do the things we need to do. And that if we are full of amazing energy and power, we can do amazing things. But we're a little different to the smartphone when we think about as our battery drops. You see, because when we're burning out, we don't automatically self-protect or even deactivate. Instead, as we can see, people who burn out, they often ignore their own warning signs and end up enduring significant personal distress. They have to suffer through things, compromising their own health. And it's kind of like, as you can see here, they don't have an override or shutdown switch. Sorry, they have both those switches, but they don't shut down like our mobile phone. Instead, they push the override switch right next to the shutdown switch. They keep overriding or ignoring all these warning signs until it's too late. And that's a reasonably good way for us to consider how we perhaps got here. To some extent, there may have been warning signs, and we might have simply been pressing on that override button. I just got to get to tomorrow. I just got to make it. I just got to make it. And so that becomes our beginning into the inquiry, if you like, about our own burnout. Why didn't we just hit the shutdown switch when our battery was getting low? Why did we push the override switch and just keep going? And so clearly, if we're in this state of burnout, we've probably gone at things too long before indeed we've ended up in this very difficult state. And we probably therefore have some sort of tendency to do that, okay? Because if we didn't have a vulnerability or a tendency towards ignoring our own distress, we wouldn't have burnt out. We would have taken action sooner. And the good example one here is compassion fatigue. So a lot of helping professionals, a lot of carers, a lot of loving parents overly invested in their children, compassion fatigue. And it's a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion, very similar to burnout, that obviously impacts that profession quite a lot. Now, the cause of that is really obvious now that we're thinking about this. Because to get compassion fatigue, I've got to be constantly hitting the override button and making myself keep going rather than hitting the stop button and allowing myself time to recover and regenerate. And therefore, the question is, well, why on earth would a human being do that? Why would they keep overriding their own distress, harming their own health? That's the question. Why do we do that? Why did I do that? Why did I do that in my burnout, myself, Pete Stebbins? And of course, the root cause, to cut straight through to it. Well, what we know here is when we feel driven to do something, we feel compelled, we hit the override switch, and often we're not even noticing that we're doing that. And we can contrast that idea with when we're simply motivated to do something. And so if we go back to this idea of compassion fatigue, it's this idea that people who end up burnt out, well, they're being driven to do their helping profession, whereas people who don't burn out are simply being motivated to be in their helping profession. Motivated or driven is a really great idea for us to now start to take stock of how did I get here, this module today. And motivation, of course, makes you feel like you can do something, get excited about it. Whereas drive makes you feel like you must do something, be compelled. And again, what we find is in the helping professions, I work in the helping profession as a psychologist. We find that a healthy version of me, when I'm motivated, it's because I genuinely want to help people and I freely choose to do that, subject to having the energy to do so. And if I don't have the energy, I simply don't do it. However, if I'm more of a driven person, a more driven psychologist, then I feel like I must help this person. That's my calling. I'm obliged to. And I'm not even tuning into my own available energy. That's not relevant. I just have to soldier on. And that drivenness is where we hit the override switch instead of the off switch. And that's where we get into trouble. Staying with this, you start to see what the consequences of these over time may be. If I'm a motivated person, it's wonderful. I get to do all these things I'm naturally motivated for. But I'm also in touch with my battery. I know how much energy I've got, and I keep stopping and or starting things in a way that maintains my energy. So it's sustainable. It's wonderful. But if I'm a driven person, I'm driven. All those corresponding thoughts and behaviors, feeling like I must do this, it's my calling, I'm obliged to, I've got to. Well, I hit the override button all the time. Yeah, I suppress any negative emotions, any fatigue, and I just soldier on. You might have heard that term, to soldier on. And that's what we do when we're driven. We just soldier on, again, for potentially noble reasons. But the consequences on our health and well-being are ultimately catastrophic. And that's what we need to start to understand when we're burnt out. Maybe there's something here for me to consider. Another thing I often get my clients to do once they've got the hang of this, and you might want to do it over the next days and weeks, is to come back to this point here about how you typically spend your day. This was a real eye-opener for me in my burnout when I actually thought about it properly. Many, many days I was driven. I was just moving from thing to thing to thing to thing because I must do it. It's values aligned. I'm obliged to do it. It's what people expect of me. And that's a really different state than being motivated each day because I want to do it. Because, yeah, that's worthwhile. Yeah, I've got the energy to do that. Let's have a go at that. Have a think about how your days work right now. And again, if you find, like me, part of your burnout is you actually, without even realizing it, spend so much of your time in a state of drivenness. Well, again, where we are in our 5 days of focus, we just want you to notice that. We want you to put that into the bigger healing journey that you might be on in recovery and reconnection. How might I shift that around? But noticing that and journaling it, that's a really good starting point. That's a really good starting point. Because of course, what we're tuning into here is how you approach life and you can, or your attitude. And you could take either of these attitudes into any activity that you're doing. So let's not feel like we suddenly have to stop or start anything. Let's simply start to notice within ourselves how much of my mind state is each day is in this motivated place versus this driven place. Now, I want to just praise you through this section being a bit text heavy here in theory, because I really want us to soak in some of the background of this. And the reason that is, of course, is that this stuff often sits in our subconscious or our unconscious. So we can easily skip over this information and not realize how important it is. So just stay with me here. As it says there, being driven. and being able to suppress emotions can really show up as an apparent strength once we're an adult. And we're quoting Gabor Mate here, who is a physician, a doctor. And he said that his drivenness meant he could just keep being an amazing doctor and bedside care and surgical procedures, even when he was hungry, stressed, or fatigued. And he was so good at that that he often wouldn't even realize he was carrying those other states. And so there's an upside to being driven. Being driven has definitely got you many successes in your life thus far. And we don't want to skip over that. We want to acknowledge that there have been upsides. But there are not just, I guess, benefits or blessings, there's also curses. Because again, staying with Dr. Mate here, his drivenness as he shares his own life story meant that he just kept overachieving at work. It was a place where he could just channel all of his energy. It made sense. And that was at the expense, as he talks about, of his own family, of his children, of his wife, of his friends, and ultimately of his health, his physical and emotional health. And so, if you can relate to this, if you're a pretty driven kind of person, and indeed that's part of maybe even how you've been very successful in life thus far, certainly true of my journey as well. We are really overachieving or over responsible or over givers. Yeah, and I'm sure you can relate to that in your own journey, or you know other people who are real overachievers or over givers, over responsible. And this is where we need to think about our life journey a bit more, because the reason we might end up there is because it's actually validating our self-worth. I feel better when I get to do that. I actually need to do it in order to feel good. Again, that's true of me in my journey. And if I need to do it in order to feel good, it means I don't feel good without it. And that's where we open up this idea of having unmet needs for acceptance and belonging. And I want to just really slow this one down because it's easy to jump over this or feel irritated by it or just kind of, I don't know, reject it. And maybe this isn't relevant. And if so, permission. But for most people who are burnt out, we felt validated by all the extra helping we were doing, or all the focus and overachieving, and all the things we were chasing or doing or trying, or all of that ended up being part of how we made sense of the world. And people probably go, yeah, yeah, sure. No worries, Pete. Fair enough. Here's the tricky bit. And if we ended up needing it, it's because we had an unmet need. So that was how we filled it. Okay, fair enough. But if we had an unmet need for fulfillment, for belonging, to feel good about ourselves, well, now we have to inquire why perhaps why wasn't I already feeling fulfilled or belonging? Why did I need the achievement? Why couldn't I just have the achievement as icing on the cake? Why was the achievement needed as cake itself? Why was I starving? What was going on that made me so driven? And that's where we open up this idea of trauma or adverse events, be they historical from the past or contemporary, recent stuff that's been going on for me. And so, as we think about this idea of being driven, suppressing our emotions, driving hard, we can again revisit, like we did in our first module, this idea of big T and little t traumas. And what we're saying here is that if I've had some of these big T or little t traumas, well, that's going to ultimately start to create needs in me, unmet needs. And at this point, we just want you to hold the idea as a possibility. We don't have to go, like we said in the first one, we don't have to go looking for things that aren't there. But if we can maintain an open mind about these things, that can be really helpful. And we know that if we've ended up as adults burning out and being super driven, and certainly that's true of me, and being over responsible for everything, that's very true of me, and overachieving, that's a ridiculous marker of my behavior. Well, we need to open up our mind and say, hey, Pete, maybe you do all of that stuff because that creates the conditions for you to feel good, to say, hey, I did the right thing. I did my workout when I didn't feel like it. And that's a way you can care for yourself or love yourself. And maybe when you were younger or when things happened where you didn't show up and do the work, instead of simply being disappointed with yourself, you actually devalued yourself. You actually put yourself down. And you don't know how to unconditionally accept yourself, Pete. Instead, you just create over and over again these conditions that you need to feel good. And that comes from a place in the past where you needed those conditions just to survive. So it comes from a place of sensibleness, but it's certainly no longer helpful now. So digging deeper into this connection between emotional suppression being driven and our childhoods. On page 19 and 20 of our book there, we describe how big T and little t traumas in childhood may be a part of the puzzle for you now. Again, may not be. But the one that was a real revelation for me was this idea of little t traumas, things that I didn't even see as traumas particularly. And a lot of that was to do with some of the parenting practices that my parents engaged in with me. And that was a real wrestle point for me, but also a gigantic aha moment. You know, when we praise our children for the fact that they got an A rather than they tried their best, that sets up that unless I achieve something, I can't accept myself. I need to achieve the standard. I can't just love and accept myself as I am, doing my best to get A's, B's, C's. No, 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 no. I've accidentally set up a condition where I have to get the A to feel good. Another common parenting trap, certainly one I was subject to, is where your parents lovingly tell you that you're so special and amazing, and you're more special than others. You've got a particular gift or whatever, and that intuitively sounds lovely. But you see, it starts to become this pressure point where, as a child, we need to keep living up to this being special. Or when things aren't going right, we blame our specialness as the reason rather than other reasons things may not be going right. And the most common one, and certainly the most devastating one, is when our parents, because they're exhausted for understandable reasons, they're tired, they're stressed, but they just can't cope and they walk away when we're upset, and that creates this, I guess, neglect or idea of abandonment or something. And that's really difficult because we keep suppressing our emotions because if we get upset, we'll get punished or my parents will walk away or send me to my room by myself. And you see, the thing is, these things are somewhat universal experiences for a lot of, if not most adults. And again, it's not to blame our parents for stuff, but it is to take an objective view about whether or not our burnout right now, whether or not there are patterns that may have begin in our childhood. That's really the inquiry we're after. When I work with my clients in this space, things like patterns of abuse are easy enough for them to identify or repressed memories, because if we think about abuse for a moment, that constitutes something that actually happened to you. But it's the neglectful things that we might encounter in our childhoods that are much trickier for us because it's the withholding of something. So you don't know it's happened to you at the time. You just assume whatever lack of support you're getting is normal. And then later on you realize, no, 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 that was neglectful. So again, I don't want to, I guess, open up that can of worms too much. We're talking about burnout here, not deeper forms of trauma. But I do think it's relevant that we consider these ideas and that we keep building that puzzle of how we ended up here. How do we get here? The point of this, of course, is if you're like me, you might now be burnt out and you're the most driven person on earth. All your friends will tell you that. And you're hyper responsible and an overachiever. You run these companies, you do these amazing things. You've got lofty goals and you just work, 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 always hustling. Well, again, if that's causing problems in your life, which is the whole point of this course, if you're burnt out because of it, then it's time to take another look at it. It's time to recognize what's unhealthy and unhelpful about that. It's perhaps where it came from. because you don't suddenly decide to do those sorts of things. You end up in these patterns because somewhere in the past, that pattern kept you alive. That pattern kept you connected. Again, staying with the book, look, it's not that our childhoods must therefore have been some um, adverse experience for us, although it's useful to understand those problems. The fact is, any of the major stressful life events we talked about in Module 1, which are capital T traumas, any of those things can drain our battery and burn us out. But as we talk about there on page 20, there's a heap of little t traumas that go on in society where we have to fit in and somehow belong and give up upon ourselves, or grin and bear it, bite our tongue. And you can see here a whole bunch, workplace personality clashes. You're going to be suppressing a fair bit of anger and stress just to get on. When meetings don't work properly in workplaces and your needs aren't met, well, again, you've got to deal with that and somehow, excuse me, suppress your emotions, task overload, lack of strategic direction, unrealistic well-being expectations. All of these things. And it's not just workplaces. In family dynamics, we have these same things playing out. And again, you might remember the metaphor of the little knots in the rope, the little T traumas, or the big knots in the rope, the big T traumas from our first module. And all of these things in their own right are relatively common because they're all just little knots in the rope. And the rope still works with the little knots, going back to that metaphor, until it doesn't anymore, until too many little knots build up on one another. And so there's just some ideas about answering this question in module 2 here. How did we end up here? How did I get here? I want you to consider, as I've talked it through, the role of any childhood experiences you've had and then adult stuff. What's going on? How did we get on the journey to be in this state of burnout now? And when we identify things that perhaps aren't so helpful, we want you to remember that anything and everything that's going on in you now that you may not like about yourself or other people, or patterns of behavior that just seem to sneak up on you, at some point in the past, they were healthy adaptations. Yeah. And way back when you first got into those patterns, you were just trying to survive. You're trying to belong. You were just trying to fit in. And it can be useful to consider, the historical positive of that stuff. Because if I can understand the reasonableness of it back in the day, I can give it permission to let go now. I can say, hey, I see how in the past I needed to be that way, but you know what? That's not helping me anymore. And I don't need to do that now. I'm not at that age. I'm not in that circumstance. And I'm this adult now with all sorts of other choices and things I can do. And I can say thank you to that bad pattern, that old adaptation. Thank you. But you're good now. I'm going to move on and try something else. I'm going to try a different way of thinking or behaving. But again, you're doing that with acceptance and warmth. You're not having to judge yourself or beat yourself up in any way. You're motivated to move on rather than being driven to move on. And we're going to cover this in more detail when we do our part 2 in practice session. So, what I want to do now, just to sort of bring us through towards the end of our in focus session, is just engage in a couple of other thoughts around emotional suppression. And I love Dr. Edith Eger's quote, "You cannot heal what you do not feel." And so, if I suppress things down, if I block things, then I don't know that I'm even feeling them. And that's pretty hard to ask an adult to try to understand something that they can't express or get in touch with or understand. It's what's impossible. And so the idea here is to consider, just entertain the idea that maybe there's a bunch of emotions over the years that I've learned not to feel. And if that's the case, certainly true for me, that's entirely normal. And the reason it's normal is most of us think that, well, look, honestly, what are you saying, Pete? If I feel angry, I'm supposed to just suddenly be angry at everybody. I'm supposed to lose my SHIT, burst into tears, fly off the handle. I can't just express my emotions willy-nilly. That'll be destructive. And that's like 100%, you can't just express your emotions willy-nilly, and you're 100% right, that will be destructive. But here's the rub. Here's the insight. Well, the insight for me, the opposite of suppression is not expression, but rather it's observation. Fantastic quote from Haemin Sunim. The opposite of suppression is not expression, but rather observation. You see, we can recognize what we're feeling. Go, oh yeah, I can feel that anger coming up. Oh wow, that loneliness, that sadness. Oh wow, I can feel it in my stomach there. And we can accept these feelings without having to express them outwardly. I'm sure you can consider that now. We just sit with this feeling of anger swirling inside you, not yet behaving outwardly, but knowing that it's there. And we can observe these feelings. Like, oh, okay, I'm noticing it. I'm not gonna press it down. I'm not gonna like explode out. I'm gonna notice it. And what's really interesting from the research around this one is 90 seconds even. If you can just hold and feel the sadness, the anger, whatever it is, and just notice it's there and observe it. Oh, yeah, here it is. Yeah, yeah. Maybe even like rate it out of 10. Oh, yeah, it's an 11 out of 10 right now. And then maybe stare at your watch and get 90 seconds through it. It won't be the same. It won't be the same. And again, the term they use in therapy is it will soften. It will soften if you can just honor yourself, just sit with it. It'll just soften. And that is gold when we're building up a roadmap for the future. How do we experience our emotions without the need to express them? I've got a little clip here. It's obviously really grainy, but I prefer, it's Haemin Sunim, the guy who we had the quote before. I just prefer to kind of get his take, hear it from him directly. So hopefully the sound will be good. What my emotion is right now, how am I feeling? And as soon as I recognize, and label, name it, either anger or frustration or sadness, whatever that is, and then you peel that, sticker off, the label off, and get in touch with the energy right underneath that emotions, then what happens is that energy of the feeling, emotion, naturally, slowly evolve, and then sooner or later it disappears. You need patience for this, though, don't you? You need to create time, you need to create space, and you need patience because if you're constantly in a rush, you don't have time to sit there with your emotions, do you? It takes only 90 seconds. The change of that, seeing the, change of your emotion. And so I really love that one. I love how it takes 90 seconds. And the first time I heard that, I was incredulous, quite frankly, because, as we'll share as our 5 days of focus journey continues, there's been all sorts of things over the years that have really built up in me that were really difficult for me. And, suppressed emotions, anger, sadness. And the idea that somehow, with 90 seconds of sitting there, I could somehow soften that emotion, be okay with that emotion, and the benefit, therefore, of not having that linger on or be bottled up inside me to come out randomly later. Like, that was a pretty wild idea for me personally in my journey to encounter. But it was so true when I could properly sit with my emotion, just sit with it, not fight it away, not resist it, not judge it even. And I did a lot of judging. I did a lot of judging with my emotions. But when I could just own it, it really was 90 seconds. It wasn't 10 out of 10 or 11 out of 10. It was like 7 out of 10. And then if I sat there for another 30 seconds, it was like 4 out of 10. And then 2 out of 10. And the more I practiced this process, the more I re-engineered, like a first aid loop. The easier it got to no longer suppress my emotions, but also to just sit with the difficult ones. And I had to do this in the middle of a workday, and I had to do this whilst I'm in the middle of parenting tired and cranky kids. And it's doable, is what I want to encourage you with here. It's doable. Look, the other thing I wanted to share with you as we bring through our in focus session, as we conclude that, is another piece of first aid. If you're like me and emotional suppression happens to be one of the challenges in your burnout. And so I want to also just get back to this idea of self-talk. And so there's observing my emotions and the clip we just watched. And then there's this idea of how I respond in my head, self-talk. They call it automatic thoughts if you've done psychology training. But as you can see here, there's suppressive responding. Just get over it. It could be worse. It's not that bad. Those reactions you have to tell yourself to suppress down. And I've found this in other ways too. Sometimes I'll swear at myself or just have this slight anger in my judgment of what's going on in the world. And anytime that's happening, that's this. That's this. And maybe you're listening to this going, "Ooh, that's me all the time." And it's like, okay, well, if you're burnt out and that's you all the time, hey, good news. Here's another marker, something to journal for the recovery journey and reconnection journey. You don't have to sort this out right now, but here's something interesting that you might mark. And what I found is that when I catch myself doing that, which even as of recording this session, I still have, I don't know, every second day, a big aha moment about how this has crept up on me. When I can turn around and go, hang on a minute, you just don't have to do that, Pete. You don't like it. Fair enough. Say so. You feel angry about it. Fair enough. Tell yourself that. You don't want to even do this. Say so. Give yourself 90 seconds. And you'll reach a point where you can set a boundary, perhaps make a decision to leave the situation. Or if you can't leave the situation, well, you won't be beating yourself up and you won't be bottling things up to explode later. And so I want you also, as you're listening, to just take note of this. And again, permission to say, hey, I don't think that's part of my sort of burnout journey at all. Or, hey, I think there might be something in that for me. I'm just going to write it down in my notes. And then as I go on my journey of healing, of recovery and reconnection, I want to come back to this idea. I want to read that part of our book again. Finally, the big ticket item when it comes to this stuff is cognitive recovery, which is about unhealthy belief patterns. And that's a bigger kind of developmental journey. And again, my clients in the therapy sessions that we run, this is where often there's a lot of extra help from me with them using these tools. The main technique here is called the ABCDE technique. And in Appendix C, you've got a chapter from a previous book I wrote, which is quite thorough in how you can harness this to re-engineer some of those more ingrained thought patterns beyond simply the first aid. So that brings us through how did I get here? Our in focus part, the knowledge and teaching part. We're going to step in a minute to the in practice session. So let's get on with that now. Okay, let's swing on over into the in practice side of this. And obviously,